Hello, everyone watching. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today we have something that's incredibly special that has been planned for you as well. We have a session named Finding Your Voice to Be a Change Agent by Michael Smith. And I would not like to take a lot of your time as well. Um, a couple of expectations that throughout the Zoom session, I would say, is that just be engaged and participate enthusiastically, keep your cameras on and mute yourself when you're not speaking and unmute yourself when you want to. Let's try to keep it more of a conversation. If you have any questions while Mike is talking, just feel free to just unmute and just tell us, because I feel that the more like it is a conversation, I believe the more that we'll also be able to get out of the experience that Mike has, and it would lead to a um, better experience sharing as well. So I'll quickly introduce the agenda. So first we have an introduction, housekeeping, which I just did before. Then we'll have a session by Mike that would start a Q&A space, and then obviously feedback for the session so that we can improve the next regional A talk that we have. So quickly passing it to David, if you could be kind enough to say a few words about Mike.
Thank you so much, Sagar. It's absolutely my pleasure. So for me, this is an example of what the Alumni Network is all about. I met Mike originally in 1980. Not even sure what month, I think it might have been October, when Mike had been identified as a prospective local committee leader and was part of a group in New York, and I was there to be one of the trainers. Actually, it was 1981, not 80, because I was PAI at the time, Secretary General. And it's been a lifelong friendship ever since. And one of the things that's hard to get a handle on when you first join AIESEC or first become a member of the alumni is the significance of the friendships that you make right now. So this is such a good example. Mike has 100 other things he could be doing right now at 3 a.m. in the morning his time, apart from sleeping. So when I reached out, of course, Mike said, yes, absolutely, I'll be happy to speak to you. So really, it's my absolute great pleasure to introduce you to one of my truly best friends, and someone who's had a very, very interesting and impactful career, Mike Smith. And Sagar is now going to go to some more of the formal introductions for Mike. Over to you.
Thank you so much for setting like an informal context. Now, I will brag a little about what Mike's achieved in his life. So Mike was the Assistant Secretary General of AIESEC-International between 1982 and 1983 term. He's the co-founder of the AIDS Memorial Quilt and served as a managing director there from 1987 to 1989. During his tenure there, the quilt grew from an idea to more than 18,000 memorial panels in 20 countries. In 1989, he and his organization were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and the film about the quilt, Common Threads, received the Academy Award for Best Documentary. Mike was the executive director of the LGBT Community Center of Colorado from 1997 to 2001 and led the effort that created domestic partner rights and transgender rights legislation that became a law there in 2002. He served as the executive director of the AIDS Emergency Fund and Breast Cancer Emergency Fund from 2002 to 2015, helping more than 25,000 disabled by HIV/AIDS or in treatment for breast cancer pay their bills while too sick to work. Mike's undergraduate degree is from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he led the local AIESEC chapter for 3 years. He received his MBA from Stanford University Graduate School of Business and certificate program from Harvard's Kennedy School of Public Policy. He resides in Washington, D.C. with his partner, Stephen Clay. Thank you so much, Michael, once again for being with us. I'll pass the sharing rights on to you. And yeah, looking forward to your session.
Okay. Thank you, Sagar. And thank you, David, for the kind words about our very, very long friendship. As David points out, I've had a rather non-traditional career path. I didn't necessarily choose that on purpose, but sometimes life takes turns that you don't see coming. In my case, 35 years ago, I was coming out as a gay man at the height of the AIDS epidemic and losing hundreds of friends in just a few years. And it has a tendency with me to change my focus and change my direction. I'll be speaking a bit about my experiences, but I want to keep it all in context from the beginning. I don't think I have unique skills or talents that helped me make a difference in the world. I think often people are thrust into their time and their place, and you deal with that. Many of you probably have better skills and talents than I had at the time as a 25 and 26-year-old when we were beginning the AIDS Memorial Quilt. I think we all have moments when we choose the safe path or the risky path, the path we're comfortable with or the path that is unknown. I hope my story inspires you to think more about the path that you're on and what you can do to take more risks, to follow your heart, to strive for a calling and not just a career. I think I've been very lucky to have a career that really has been a calling and has not been the kind of corporate career that I think I expected. I expected to have a career in international marketing. At Georgetown Free University in the early 80s, I was president of the AIESEC chapter for 3 years there. Had an opportunity to meet David and others that broadened my horizons a bit. So that when I finished college, I took a traineeship in Finland with the Union Bank of Finland. And then in a very surprising turn of events, ended up at AIESEC-International, doing corporate relations and marketing with a team of people that I had come to know and love even before my term started in 1982 and 83. At Stanford, I focused on international marketing and even had a summer job at American Express and was intending that that's what was going to happen for my life, that I would go to work for American Express. Like all of you, I had many friends through AIESEC and at university, but I never felt I could be my authentic self. I was afraid of the rejection if people knew that I was gay, and it hindered many of my relationships, even with David and other people, until I got to a point where I felt comfortable being my authentic self. All that changed in business school when I fell in love with a wonderful man named Jeff Phillips, who was a classmate at Stanford. But Jeff had been working for 2 years with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in Honduras before grad school. And a few months after we became a couple, he became terribly sick. Stanford Medical School ran tests for every known tropical disease, convinced that he had picked up something in the jungles of Honduras. But eventually they realized, as I think you might be if you're listening to my story, they discovered that he had AIDS. I became his primary caregiver for the next year. And you'd expect that Stanford Business School would be a cutthroat and competitive kind of environment, but he and I actually had incredible support from my classmates and my peers, even back then in 1984, when fear and stigma around AIDS were off the chart. I remember this before there was a test. Remember, this was before there was a test for AIDS, before there was any treatment, and nearly everyone died of AIDS. After a horrible year, Jeff did die at Christmas in 1985. After he died, being pretty sure that I was going to get AIDS and die soon, I really didn't have the energy for a career in corporate America. I was at a bit of a loss of what to do and feeling the loss greatly of someone who was so close to me. I was living with friends in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco, which like Greenwich Village in New York City was one of the hubs of gay liberation in the 70s. But by then, in the early 80s, it was really the epicenter for the AIDS epidemic. After Jeff died, I really wasn't too interested in the corporate career. I was living in San Francisco at the time in the Castro neighborhood, which was at that point the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic. And as David recalls, he was there, I think, in '89. But by the spring of 1987, more than 1,000 people in the 10-block radius of Castro and Market Streets had died of AIDS. Another 2,000 people were living with AIDS. Eventually, 90% of them would also die. There were 50 or 60 obituaries per week in the local paper. And it got to the point where they had to limit obituaries to 200 words because there just wasn't space. It was really a dark time. Everyone knew someone who was dying, and clearly everyone was taking care of someone who was sick. It was a very dark time. You could see people on the street and you'd look at them and you knew they were sick, and you knew you were probably never going to see them again. It was a really dark time. And it was clear that politically we were being left to die by a president who hadn't said the words AIDS, and by a government that at that point wasn't putting any resources into care or treatment, and even by the American people. We felt like that the majority of Americans had decided that this wasn't something that they were at risk for, and therefore it wasn't their problem. We were politically inconvenient, and so we were being ignored. In an attempt to get some publicity for our plight, my dear friend Clete Jones asked people to come to a rally at City Hall and to to bring names, signs with the names of people who had died of AIDS. And when they got there, they taped them all on the front of the federal building at City Hall, and it looked like a giant quilt. Just as he said the word quilt, I think he had an aha moment of what this might be able to do as a metaphor. Quilting in America is a long tradition. Americans think of pioneer women crossing the frontier and making quilts together to give to other families. And it connotes your grandmother taking care of you and wrapping you in a quilt when you're sick as a child. It was everything that was about warmth and comfort, and so much not how the country was responding to AIDS, with fear and stigma and distance. And he just thought, maybe this is a way to break through. Maybe this is a metaphor for something that people might grab onto. Maybe a giant colorful quilt with the names of people who had died of AIDS could help the world see us as human beings and be moved to action. Or maybe not. We were really clear that this might not work. But in many ways, I mean, we were dying already, and we had to do something. So why not a quilt? It didn't get a whole lot of support at first. Many people thought it was a waste of time and unlikely to make a difference. I remember my housemates asking how I was going to explain to my parents that I was using my newly minted Stanford MBA to start a gay quilting circle. So there was a lot of concern that this wasn't the appropriate thing. But we got a shopkeeper in the Castro to give us a storefront. And we put out signs, we put flyers on telephone poles announcing a volunteer meeting, the first volunteer meeting. And this was before the internet, this was long before social media. And telephone poles in the Castro were how people actually communicated in the old days. So, we did the thing everybody did. You tear down somebody else's flyer and you put up yours. We put out a press release announcing that we would have a giant quilt with the names of people who had died of AIDS, and that we would display it in the National Mall near the White House during the March on Washington for Gay and Lesbian Rights that October of 1987. Which at the time of the press release was only 135 days away. What we didn't tell anyone in the press release is we didn't have any quilt sections yet. We were sort of the beginning of fake news all those years ago. And that continued later. We borrowed some money to purchase a mailing list, which at the time, before the internet, You got the labels and you put them on the envelopes and you licked all the stamps. And we sent out 2,000 pieces of mail that had flyers inside to grief counselors around the country. We were thinking that in terms of families who had lost people to AIDS that weren't in one of these epicenters, maybe that's a way to reach them. And we sent the mailing out in early June and then kind of forgot about it. And we had that first volunteer meeting in June 1987. 8 people came to that meeting, off to a really great start. It wasn't exactly the 8 people you would choose if you were doing a startup. It included an antique dealer, a woman who worked at the cosmetics counter at Macy's, a lesbian who had been both a truck driver and a bridal consultant, and an elementary school teacher, and 2 people, a couple, who had both lost their jobs when their employers found out that they had AIDS and they weren't working. None of us had any idea what we were doing, but we were all bound together by the shared conviction that we had to do something, anything, to get the attention of the rest of the world. And if we couldn't, we and everyone we knew would die alone and forgotten. If you look at the AIDS Memorial Quilt now, I wish I had some photos here I could put up of it, but they'll find their way into this eventually. You can see the artistry and the love, the color and the richness of each of the panels that were handmade by someone who loved someone they'd lost to AIDS. But it didn't start out that way. We've got some, let's see what I can do here. I might be able to show
Is this image appropriate? Like, is this the right?
That's terrific. That's terrific. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's terrific. That's the picture of the first display in 1987, and that's a great image to start with. It didn't start out as this beautiful, warm, wonderful thing. In that summer of 1987, the quilt was really a desperate attempt to be heard. It was a protest banner. We were angry. Panels are 3 feet by 6 feet, which is the size of a grave. I mean, we really looked at this as we're going to drag our dead to Washington and lay them out on America's front lawn until attention would be paid. And that anger is kind of hard to hold on to, but it had a lot to do with where we were emotionally at the time. I don't think we appreciated the beauty that it might eventually become. I think we always knew that there was a way that the protest banner we were making would become a symbol of compassion and a loving response to AIDS. But even if that didn't happen, and we were concerned that it wouldn't catch on, we were still going to make sure that come hell or high water, we had a quilt on the mall that October that would make a statement. We wrote out a big wish list of what we wanted on butcher paper, and we put it up in the window of the storefront saying, you know, this is who we are and this is what we're doing, and we need scissors and glue and fabric and sewing machines and basically everything. Within a day, we put that up on a Friday night, and by Saturday morning, when we got there, people were lined up down the street holding boxes of things that were on the list. And it was really clear to us that we had tapped into something and that we weren't the only ones who were trying to figure out what to do and how to make a difference. Everybody wanted to help. We convinced the mayor to allow us to hang a few quilt panels off the mayor's balcony at City Hall. And then we went around that whole day telling everyone that this was just a small sample of all the panels that we had for the quilt, and this was going to be a wild success, when in fact that was literally every panel we had hanging off the balcony. But within a few weeks, the workshop kind of became a community center. We never anticipated it, but people would come in after work and help other people make panels. It became a place where people could come when they were testing positive and needed someone to talk to. It became this sort of safe space in the middle of an otherwise decimated neighborhood. It really felt for a while there like anytime we put out a call for resources or for a particular skill, somebody would show up who could do it, which was terrific because, as I said, the 8 of us who were there really didn't necessarily have the skills to do this. In no time at all, we really had a bit of an army of gay men and lesbians and many straight allies who had found some better part of themselves to come in and offer to us when we needed it. People were making panels for dead lovers, and the media started to notice, and reporters would come by. And Cleve and I would tell them how many panels we had made and we had so far and walk them through the space. And then they would leave, and we would run to this little cubicle we had in the back of the building and cross out whatever the old number was and put in the new number. And that was whatever number of panels we had told that reporter we had, so that when the next reporter came in, you would put a larger number down, even though there was absolutely no bearing between the number we were giving and what we actually had. And we got way ahead of ourselves. I think by the time September 1st came around, with about 40 days to go until we were going to do this display, I think it was very much a project of the Castro. And despite all the publicity we were getting, it didn't seem to be catching on. The rest of America wasn't sending us quilt sections. And we had that really sinking feeling that we were really still on our own, and that nobody really was paying attention, and that it wasn't going to work. But then you remember that mailing that we did to grief counselors that we forgot about? We'd said in that mailing that if you got us quilt sections by September 15th, we would sew them into the quilt and they would be on the mall in Washington, less than a month later. And in our darkest moment, when we were convinced that this was not going to work, we got a call from the post office on about September 13th, and they said, you have a lot of mail, you should bring your truck. And my dear volunteer coordinator, Jack, was like, oh, we have a lot of mail, we should bring the truck. Oh, we don't have a truck. So Jack had a convertible Mustang, and we put the top down, and we'd made 8 trips to the post office and filled it with boxes that had come from all across the country. And over 4 days, we piled them all in the front window. We had big plate glass windows. We piled them in the front window. And over the course of 4 days, it got to the point where you could not see out the windows. There were boxes everywhere. And they were coming from families. We had panels from all 50 states in those 4 days. They were coming from mothers. I still get choked up when I think about this. They were coming from mothers who couldn't tell their church support group what their son had died of. They were coming from fathers who couldn't tell anyone in his extended family or work that he'd lost a son to AIDS. They were as desperate as we were for connection. And these women knew how to sew. These weren't protest banners. These were beautiful works of art. And they weren't making a protest banner. We were. They weren't. Most of their sons had died in urban centers and had been cremated by friends, and there was no gravesite. And what we heard over and over from the mothers was, this is a gravesite. And we went sort of overnight from a protest banner to the world's most colorful cemetery. And we suddenly realized we had allies in all sorts of places all across the country. It was everything we could have hoped for. I remember a woman, my dear friend, Sue Caves, who I didn't know at the time, drove up from Long Beach, an elderly member of the Republican steering committee of the Long Beach City Council, drove up with a panel she'd made for her son, Michael. And she stood outside the plate glass windows there for an hour, looking in and holding onto a piece of fabric wrapped up near her. And eventually Jack went out and Gert went out and sort of brought her in, and we all sat and talked with her for the longest time. And it was pretty clear we were being tested. She wanted to make sure that her son was going to find a good home. And over the course of about an hour, eventually she slid the panel for Michael across the table to us. And she became such an important dear friend of mine and such an important ally in the cause, who could really speak to mothers in a way that we couldn't necessarily. So it really went from bed sheets and spray paint to really being a work of art. Hang on a second, I got all emotional there, sorry. Of course, 800 pieces of overnight mail created this other crisis of a bunch of people who didn't know what they were doing. We were panicked about how to get them opened and sewn together and display and ready and cataloged and into the display and on the mall. And again, we kind of put out a call, and like so often with this project, I think often with community-based projects like this, if you ask, people will respond. And we went overnight from a few people sewing together the panels that came in to running a full steam sewing operation that ran 24 hours a day for 3 weeks. We had volunteers that would call in sick for the day and come in and sew panels together. Other people that would work all day and come in the evening and sew until midnight or 1 or 2. And we had a team of people who would come in at 3 in the morning every day, which sitting here at 3 in the morning now, I'm realizing how hard that was, and sew until they went to work in the morning. And somehow we got it done. And there are lots of other stories, but the story I learned that summer was ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It happened over and over and over. And somehow or another, by close to the right deadline, we had sewn all the quilt together. The stress of those last month was incredible. I was 27, in way over my head. We kind of learned that we couldn't deal with whatever the crisis was right there. We had to sort of think one crisis ahead, and figure out how to take care of that one and sort of deal with whatever we were dealing with. I think the thing that I learned from that I've held for my whole career is when you're in the midst of something like that, you have to be able to differentiate what's the center and what's the edges. Cleve and I felt like we had to hold on to the mission and the vision and the core, but we didn't know how to do most of what needed to happen. We had to find a way to let go of the things on the edges and let people with the skills to do those things step in and take them on and run with them. And I mean, Cleve and I were fighting nonstop in those days over what seemed like little things. And it took years for me to go back and think about that and realize we weren't fighting over little things. We were fighting over our definition of what's a core and what's an edge, and where the core becomes an edge, and what things we each had to let go of in order for it to succeed, or which things we had to let go of because they would drag us down and drown us if we didn't let go and let other people in. It was a remarkable moment later to look back on it and realize the lessons that I learned at such a young age. We did get a giant quilt made up of 2,000 memorial panels to Washington, D.C. 200 volunteers met us at midnight and worked all night to lay out the walkways in the dark. And at dawn, we had a beautiful unfolding ceremony of these 2,000 panels. Again, it would be wonderful to be able to share some images, and I'm sorry that I can't. The media coverage was overwhelming. We had broadcast crews there from all around the country, and actually all around the world. That night, Sunday night, October 11th, 1987, there was a story and an image about our quilt on basically every television station in the United States, big cities, small towns. And it was really the first time that a lot of people heard the word AIDS or saw something positive about gay people on their television screen in Middle America. And by the next day, we were the image above the fold in every paper in the world, from Sydney to Moscow. Everybody was captivated by what we had done, and the reporters, the international reporters in particular, but also the domestic reporters, could talk to just about anyone at the quilt display, and they would hear their story of the panel that they made for a real person, and it changed everything. In a single day, we changed the national conversation about AIDS. We moved it from a talk about stigma and other people to being a story about love and compassion. We didn't know it at the time because many of us were thinking that this is something we were going to do for that summer, and then we would go back to our regular lives, which never happened. But we ended up doing tours of the quilt in '88 and '89. The 2,000 panels at that first display became 8,000 panels at the display in DC a year later, and then 12,000 at the display in 1989. Because we had this army of mothers, we were able to get access to places we wouldn't have been able to have as a bunch of gay men. We arranged for literally every member of Congress to have a visit by a mother holding a panel for their dead son. And that literally transformed Congress. And over the course of that year, Congress voted almost unanimously for $1 billion for AIDS research and $1 billion for medical care. We didn't do this alone. There were lots of other organizations working on this in different angles of it and all the rest. But we had shifted the dialogue and had a really big impact. The quilt had several big displays after that. In 1992, we had 20,000, and in 1996, the last big display outdoors on the mall, which I came back onto staff to manage because I'm the only one that's ever done any of the logistics of the big displays. We had 45,000 panels. The displays from 1996 went all the way from the Capitol to 2 kilometers away to the Washington Monument, and all that length of the National Mall and all down under the trees. It took 11,512 volunteers and 1.1 million people came to see the display, including the Clintons and the Gores. And that display happened just before protease inhibitors came out, which were the really life-saving things for so many people. It was the last big chance to get media news around AIDS when people were willing to hear it, when it was still a crisis. Luckily, within a few months of that display, protease inhibitors were being prescribed to people, and people were living a lot longer, and we'd kind of gotten through the dark days. I mean, what we did was very successful in terms of social change. And it was certainly a unique and unusual approach to what to do. My parents did come around. They came to all those quilt displays and were very proud of my work. But I think they did have a moment of, "You're doing what now, son?" in the early days. But what we were doing may have been unique, but I think the underpinnings are very common. I think that a small group of committed and dedicated people, often without the skills required of the job, can do really extraordinary things. And often come together on projects like this just because they have to do something, anything to address a problem. Not every small stone you throw into a lake is going to create a tsunami like we did. But the act of throwing the stone is still valuable. It creates ripples, and you never know where those ripples are going to go. And, you know, we started out thinking we would be really happy if we had a little ripple, and we kind of hit it out of the park. But I've seen so many examples since then of projects where people have wanted to galvanize people around a cause and have done it in many ways the same way we did, by making it personal, by involving their story of someone and making it human. And I think that's the thing that we hit upon that made such a difference. You know, I think the world is filled with complicated and seemingly intractable problems. On a global scale, there's climate change. on so many national and local scales. Every one of our countries is dealing with something that seems unsolvable. And too often I hear from people who are complaining about the problem and kind of waiting for the right person to come along with the right skill set to solve the problem. And I mean, I think I'm kind of proof that it's not, don't wait around for that other person because they're not coming. You are that other person. And even if you don't think you've got the skills to do something, you are more powerful than you think. You know, I went on to a long career doing HIV and AIDS work that wasn't anything like international marketing. You know, Jeff's death and all of this changed the whole direction of my life. And I've had an extraordinarily fulfilling career. Not necessarily gotten rich, but, you know, not doing too bad. But all because I was willing to take a chance and say, I'm just going to have to do something. And we just happened to hit upon something that really worked. I'm going to end with this. One of my favorite quotes is from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist who spent most of her life in Samoa. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I live by that, and that's sort of the mantra I put out in the world on a regular basis. So that's my story, and that's what we did. And I was able to find my voice simply by raising my hand and saying, I'll give this a try, even though I didn't have the skill set for it. And it worked. And I've seen so many other cases in my life where people have stepped up in a way that changed everything. You need to take the road less traveled. You need to take the road that comes with risk. And the risk is the risk of failure. And if you can be comfortable with that, you can change the world. So that's my story with no slides. So.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think the first thing I'm probably going to do after this is grab lunch and watch Common Threads. I found it.
Yeah.
This happened obviously like before I was born, and not knowing what happened. I think that's really something, and I think it's definitely something I would like to have a look at.
Yeah, it was a very powerful documentary. Dear friends of mine went through the quilt panels and found 5 that they wanted to tell the background stories of, and they wove it all together into a really spectacular documentary. And someday I'll give you long stories about my fabulous night of 24 hours in LA carrying an Oscar. It's like having the ruby slippers. You can do anything you want in LA for 24 hours if you're holding an Oscar. I have a great picture of Diana Ross sitting on my lap kissing my Oscar. So life has its, in the midst of all of this darkness, there were several moments of pure joy, and that was one of them. And we did, even within the second year, even by 1988, we had people who had seen the quilt who wanted to do similar things in other countries. I spent December of 1988 actually in Sydney, helping a group there start an Australian quilt project. But by the end of our first year, we had 40 chapters going in countries around the world who, even if they didn't have a quilting tradition, they had started something similar, where using art as the medium and telling people's individual stories, they were creating memorials, which is why Cleve and I were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, was because of the work around the world, really, helping people understand the personal side and the enormity of the AIDS crisis. We only lost because the Berlin Wall came down that year and Gorbachev beat us. Still don't like the man, but anyway. So it was a remarkable ride. It was. I've had a colorful life, a really colorful life. So.
I think that's good to hear. I think we'll probably take maybe a couple of questions and wrap up in like the next 15 minutes. Yeah. Thank you so much, David, for sharing that. Um, yeah, I think Chiao unmuted. Is there something that you'd like to? Yeah. Your voice is quite robotic.
You're all broken up. It's all broken up. It's hard to hear you.
You're sounding like a Dalek from Doctor Who.
Yes, you are.
I think if you can join from your phone, that might be better, like a quicker way to sort your audio.
Now you can hear me?
Yeah,
There we go.
Thanks.
Yes. Yay. Okay.
Now it is, I don't know if it is a question, but I want your opinion. Which kind of tips or advice that you can have for someone in this year that we have right now, like we facing the pandemic, how can we build and make stronger social and political works? I'm gonna put you guys in my reality. I'm an AIESEC alumni. I'm a PWD person. I have hearing loss, also a gay man. So thank you so much for sharing your history. Here in Brazil, we have more than 500 years of history, and we never had a association that fought for the rights of sociologists in general. And last year, I joined it with some college professors, and then we founded one to work for the rights of the sociologists and also for the right to the kids and teenagers have the right to study sociology as a mandatory class in the school. And it's something so basic that when we talk and try to hear, but right now in Brazil, as you can see in the news, we have this horrible president that don't believe in science, thought that COVID was just a little flu. And even trying to work and join with people to defend LGBTQIA plus rights and talk for something so basics. I still feel that it's like baby slow steps all the time, especially if you guys work in AIESEC, even we working about leadership and interchange, when you go into the real world, as we can say, the things are not so bright and easy that we fall to. So which kind of tips that you can see? Because right now, even with the pandemic, we can see that the society in general is some kind of collective grief. And sometimes to talk about politics, it's hard. People are tired too. So which kind of advice could you give us? Because sometimes a random news that I'm gonna say here, I'm in Recife, a city in Brazil, and in this week, an entire classroom of teenagers have a collective anxiety attack. Like 40 kids in a classroom have an anxiety attack collective, and you need to talk, bring a lot of doctors to talk for each one of them. So I don't know, because seems to a dark times, and sometimes this kind of political and social fights are for the long run, things that we're gonna see the change in a 10, 15 years. And I don't know, it's because I really appreciate and thankful for your kind of fight, because your fight in your country makes my life easier as a LGBTQIA please, as a gay man right now. And I really appreciate that. But I don't know, in your opinion, which kind of advice can give us, So I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for speaking up and and saying something about the situation there. Sorry, I'm going to have a sip of water. I'm losing my voice. So much of what we do is about the long run. I think we're all really lucky if in the short term we can bring about a big change. I think so much of what happens with social justice movements is hard, tedious work of laying a groundwork, knowing that it's going to take years sometimes for it to pay off. I think, again, I think we were extremely lucky that what we had and what we were thinking resonated so well so quickly, that we could have the kind of impact we had. I don't think, when we were starting out, I don't think any of us thought that we were going to have that kind of impact so quickly. I will say, though, that I think what made the difference for us was, I think LGBT people in general are marginalized and lumped into a category, and the straight world doesn't necessarily see us as humans. They see us as this political movement or as something that's other. And I think the thing we had going for us was all of those mothers, that we found a way to connect with a different population in the mainstream, and having that coalition made all the difference. And so I'm always excited when I see other projects going on that are about that kind of bridge building, because I think that's really the way to go. You can scream in the wilderness all you want and not be heard. And the trick is finding other people who have power, frankly, and leveraging that for yourself, and making your cause their cause. And it doesn't happen overnight. I think COVID's been a fascinating example. I've given a lot of interviews in the last couple of years, because people are looking for a way to acknowledge the dead and a way to grieve. And that tends to drive people toward the quilt idea. So I've had a lot of people say, well, should there be a quilt for people who have died of COVID? What should we be doing? And I don't have an answer to that. I fielded an awful lot of inquiries from people who wanted to start something similar for COVID. But I think the bigger issue for me with COVID is, for a lot of us, COVID is not the pandemic of our lifetime. AIDS was, and nobody should have to live through two pandemics. And here I am, slogging through the second one. And it brings up all, even with everything I've done publicly, a lot of those dark years are inside a box, pushed down in here someplace. And COVID just brought it all back up to the surface. For a lot of people I know, the PTSD of all those years ago came right back when the epidemic hit. And I don't think, and I haven't seen anything yet in any country in the world who's adequately dealt with the emotional toll that COVID has taken on their population. No one has sat down and acknowledged, we lost 100,000 people, we lost 500,000 people. In the US soon, we will have lost 1 million people. And you cannot just take 1 million people out of society and go on. At some point, you have to acknowledge the loss. People have to process this. And I'm not seeing yet the way that that's going to happen. I'm sorry I don't have a better solution to your dilemma. Yeah, but I so appreciate that you're on here and that you're.
Sometimes we just don't need the answers, but
Yeah.
each share feelings,
Right. Right.
really
So
being honest.
yeah, I feel you. I feel you. So yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Mm. Yeah. So, anybody else with questions or comments?
I'd like to share a couple of things and ask a couple of questions.
Okay, sure.
Is that
Of course,
okay?
you were the one. I could see you there taking notes, so I'm going to get grilled.
Honest
by
to
you.
God.
So
I mean, seriously, I'm absolutely delighted with the fact that you've shared like this. Because I remember meeting you before you were even out. Yep.
oh yeah.
So a few things. For me, I wrote down a couple of things you actually said, which for me actually is part of a tapestry. And they're takeaways from everyone who watches this, because these things aren't just about the Quilt, the Names Project. They're about any kind of challenge that one comes across in life. One was such a basic thing: ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It's not just a clever phrase. You have embodied that, as you said. Another one was no need to wait for the right person with the right skill set. I think that's profoundly important for any of us. The third was, strive for a calling, not just a career. Yep, absolutely. For me, one of the things that's really resonated as well, though, is when you said that it's important to differentiate between what's at the center and what's at the edges, because there's a danger of being overwhelmed by the things at the edges. And I have to say, I'm in that space right now. These sorts of challenges are there to face anyone in the alumni community, whether they are 20 or whether they're 100 years old. These are things that are relevant now in making in the choices that we make. And for me, one thing I want to sort of ask or share, I'm not sure really what it is. And because it goes to the question that I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is it Chao? The gentleman from Brazil. Forgive me. But this isn't, for me. I try to bring these things back to the relevance of a network, right? Our friendships, or whether it's alumni or whether it's not. And for me, I'm very curious. I have the impression that, for example, like one of the decisions that you took at one point was to come out, and you came out when the challenges, when that was a huge challenge to even do that, because there was so much stigma, and not that that's all gone, but still it was huge at the time, and then to get involved publicly in a movement like you did and create it. I just have this feeling that whether it was AIESEC or could have been another friendship group, the fact of it was that I can attest to the fact that when Mike came out, people like myself who knew Mike, who didn't know he was gay, didn't give a shit. We already knew and loved Mike.
Right.
So for me, that's one of the things about an organization or a network, like whether it's AIESEC or the alumni, because you have a safe space to actually share who you really are. And I do think you're a perfect example of that, where that has ended up with extraordinary consequences. So I just wanted to ask you, I know there were so many things that would have influenced or helped you find the courage both to come out, but then also get involved in these various projects. What was the relevance? Like, what was the difference that it made to you to be in a community of friends, however you had met them?
So much of my coming out was related to Jeff having AIDS. I was out to a few people by the time he and I met, but it was, I think, common at the time that a lot of people came out because of AIDS, and I feel like everything combined to bring about that moment. And for me, it very much was, I had a very large network of good friends in graduate school at Stanford. an environment that you usually think of as being cutthroat and competitive and, the best of the best, blah, blah, blah. They really rallied around me and around Jeff when he got sick. And I think that made it much easier for me to come out, knowing that these people were already predisposed not to have a lot of the prejudices that were common at the time around gay people and around AIDS. They offered me the safe space I needed to do my own work around this. And yeah, I mean, I within a few years of me leaving AIESEC-International, there was a Secretary General who was openly gay, which was remarkable to me at the time. But within 3 or 4 years, that happened. But something about the international aspect of AIESEC actually made it difficult to come out, because so many people were from other cultures that were not as accepting as mine. I remember conversations with Teresa and lots of people about whether to run for Secretary General, and I couldn't make it work. The African bloc would have not come with me. The Latin American bloc would not have come with me, because it was becoming more and more clear as I was there that I was gay. And that was a reality that at some point I just had to deal with. But that friendship network makes all the difference. And I think it makes all the difference for you, David. I think it helps you and other people who were my friends to see that I'm gay and I'm no different than I was before, and that moves you along on a spectrum. And I think that's in some ways the obligation that a lot of us have as gay people, is to help straight people be a little uncomfortable until they figure out that you're just like them, except you're gay. And that the being out is political. Being out alters all the people around you, and it's important to do that work. I mean, this I've said this before, and it's controversial sometimes in gay circles when I say it. If we had not had AIDS, I don't think we would have gay marriage. I think AIDS forced so many people out, and it helped Middle America see that the people they knew and loved were gay, and unfortunately were sick and dying. But it shifted the balance of people's understanding that there are gay people all around them. And it moved the needle in terms of social justice so far, so fast, that our civil rights movement has taken 30 years when the African American civil rights movement has taken 200. It was a terrible price to pay, all those people who died of AIDS. But it forced a reckoning in America. It brought gay people into every household, which then made it possible for things like gay marriage. Again, terrible price to pay, but it did. To your earlier point about the core versus the edges, I think that's what I took away years later from what we had done, was how we managed to hold it together. And it's still amazing to me. And you kind of learn every day on the job. And yes, there is a fear when you've got a project like this that's growing quickly, that everyone wants to be part of. You need to figure out what things to hold on to because they're a core principle or value of the entity, and which things you have to let go of because they'll drown you if you don't. And you need someone with different skill sets to do them. The flip side is also true, though, of if you miscalculate what's the core and what's not, your core gets polluted. And you get people coming in who want to be helpful, but whose vision and mission is a little different from yours. And it can pull the mission and the direction of the whole organization off unless you guard it and protect it. And that's really difficult, to not let to figure out where that edge is, what you have to hold on to and what you have to let go of gets really gray right there outside the core, but not quite to the edges. And it was a constant struggle. We had a couple of core tenets that there would be no political speeches at quilt displays. There is nothing except the reading of the names. No one is ever allowed to speak. No politician is going to get up there and try to claim this as their thing and go on and on and on. And I have sat there with the cord and literally pulled the electricity off the microphone if somebody decides that they're going to give a speech. And that endless controversy over, well, why can't we just have a simple little, the mayor would really like to say a few things, and he or she has been really influential in helping us get this display, and no, you don't. This is not about the mayor. This is about these people who have died. It's about who they are and their names. And if the mayor can't act like a normal human being, the mayor can't speak. And there are a dozen things like that that make the ritual of a quilt display what it is. And it is a ritual. There's an unfolding ceremony that goes a certain way. We take very seriously the emotional impact we're trying to have. We put a lot of thought into the ceremony of it all and the ritual of it all. And lots of people would like to tinker or would have liked to tinker with that on the edges. And that became the thing we had to hold on to, because it was all about the perception and the message you're putting out, and less about the logistics of a display or something where compromises can be made. But we struggled. I mean, Cleve and I struggled with that. We had very different ideas about where that edge was, and oh boy, we fought hard. Yeah, I threw a lamp at him once, and he threw shoes at me once in a hotel room. It was a. We were kids. He was 33 and I was 27. So, these things happen. We were both way in over our heads. So anyway.
Thank you so much, Michael. We'll just quickly take like a last round of questions if anyone has any, or otherwise we'll move towards the closing of the session.
I just want to say, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your story. It is very inspiring, especially as Sagar mentioned, a lot of things happened before I was even born. I'm 26 now. And I can only imagine the kind of passion to, you sort of probably didn't know that it's going to turn into this big movement, but you just started with what you had. And
Right. And I tell people all the time, just start with what you have, just do something, anything. The odds that something or anything you're doing might not work are probably pretty high, but the odds of doing nothing means there's zero probability that you're going to make a difference. So you just have to jump in with both feet.
So important. So great to know you, Michael. Just want to say
thank you.
All right.
All right.
So I'll move on to wrapping up the space. Thank you so much, Michael, once again for sharing your story.
Welcome.